At the airport, my daughter-in-law hugged me and said, "Just a little prank to lighten the trip." Minutes later, a customs officer unzipped my purse and pulled out a plastic bag full of white powder. I didn't panic. I just asked for one call. The fluorescent lights above seemed to buzz louder as Officer Martinez held up the bag, examining it with the kind of scrutiny I'd seen countless times from my bench. 23 years as a family court judge had taught me to read faces, and his expression told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't routine. This was deliberate. "Ma'am, can you explain what this is?" His voice carried that practiced neutrality law enforcement uses when they think they have you cornered. I looked at Amanda, my daughter-in-law, who stood 15 feet away at the departure gate. Her face had gone pale, but there was something else there. Something I recognized from years of watching guilty parties in my courtroom.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
Relief mixed with fear. She'd expected this moment, planned for it even. "I have no idea what that is, officer," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I've never seen it before in my life." Amanda rushed over, her designer heels clicking against the airport tile. "Oh my God, Anna, what's happening?" Her performance was almost convincing. Almost. But I'd watched too many liars try to sell their stories to a judge. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 hours earlier, I'd been sitting in my modest apartment, carefully packing for what Amanda had described as a family bonding trip to Hawaii. She'd insisted on picking me up, insisted on helping me pack, insisted on carrying my purse while I used the restroom. Every insistence now made perfect sense. "Your mother-in-law is being detained for possession of what appears to be cocaine," Martinez explained, sealing the bag in an evidence pouch. "Ma'am, you're going to need to come with me." As they led me toward the security office, I caught Amanda's eye. For just a moment, her mask slipped. I saw satisfaction there. Victory. She thought she'd won whatever game she'd been playing with me for the past 3 years. The walk through the terminal felt surreal. Travelers stared as I was escorted past them, their faces showing the mixture of curiosity and judgment I'd seen directed at defendants in my courtroom. The difference was, I'd always been on the other side of that equation. Until now. The interrogation room was smaller than the ones I'd seen attorneys use with their clients. Cinderblock walls painted institutional beige. A metal table bolted to the floor, and that particular smell of industrial disinfectant that never quite covers the scent of fear and desperation. "Mrs. Hoffman," Martinez began, settling into the chair across from me. "This is a serious situation. We found approximately 2 grams of what field tests indicate is cocaine in your personal bag. Do you understand the charges you're facing?" I folded my hands on the table, the same way I used to when listening to particularly ridiculous arguments from defense attorneys. "Officer Martinez, I understand the law better than most. I also understand my rights. I'd like to make my phone call now." He studied my face, probably looking for the signs of guilt or panic he was used to seeing. Instead, he found the same composed expression that had intimidated lawyers for over 2 decades. I'd perfected this look during my first year on the bench, when young attorneys thought they could bulldoze a female judge with aggressive posturing. "You seem awfully calm for someone facing felony drug charges," he observed. "I'm 65 years old. Officer, I've seen enough in my lifetime to know that panic never solved anything." I leaned back slightly. My phone call? The truth was, I felt anything but calm. Beneath my composed exterior, my mind was racing, analyzing every detail of the past few weeks. Amanda's sudden interest in spending time with me. Her insistence that we needed to start fresh as a family. The way she'd offered to handle all the travel arrangements. I'd been suspicious of her motives from the beginning. After 3 years of subtle hostility and not-so-subtle attempts to push me out of my son David's life, her sudden warmth had felt manufactured. But even I hadn't imagined she'd go this far. 20 minutes later, I was escorted to a payphone that looked like it belonged in a museum. My fingers trembled slightly as I dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. Not since my retirement party. "Wallace and Associates," came the familiar voice. "Michael, it's Anna Hoffman." "Judge Hoffman?" The surprise in Michael's voice was genuine. He'd been my court clerk for 15 years before going to law school. Now he ran one of the most successful criminal defense practices in the state. What's wrong? I need you at LAX Airport Security, Terminal 2. I've been arrested for drug possession. Silence. Then a low whistle. Judge, with all due respect, that's the last thing I expected to hear from you. Are you serious? Deadly serious. And Michael? Bring everything you can find on Amanda Hoffman, maiden name Phillips. I have a feeling this isn't as random as it appears. Jesus, Anna. What has that woman done now? Michael's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many domestic cases gone wrong. I'll be there in 40 minutes. Don't say another word to anyone. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced since retiring from the bench. The familiar thrill of a complex case unfolding, the satisfaction of seeing through someone's lies to the truth beneath. Amanda thought she was dealing with a helpless old woman, a retired judge living on a pension, dependent on her son's family for social interaction. Someone who could be easily discredited and pushed aside. She had no idea she'd just picked a fight with someone who'd spent 23 years dismantling carefully constructed deceptions. Walking back to the holding area, I thought about the last time I'd seen Amanda before today. It was at David's birthday dinner 2 weeks ago. She'd been unusually pleasant, almost deferential. She'd asked about my health, my living arrangements, whether I was managing okay on my own. At the time, I'd assumed she was finally making an effort to be civil. Now I realized she'd been gathering intelligence, learning about my routine, my vulnerabilities, my isolation, building a profile of the perfect victim. When Officer Martinez returned, I was ready. My attorney is en route, I informed him. Until he arrives, I have nothing further to say. He nodded, looking slightly disappointed. We'll hold you until he gets here. But Mrs. Hoffman, the evidence is pretty clear-cut. You might want to consider cooperating. At your age, a felony conviction could mean serious prison time. I almost smiled. Clear-cut evidence was exactly what Amanda thought she'd created. What she didn't understand was that in my experience, when something looked too perfect, too obvious, it usually was. The holding cell was exactly what I expected. Concrete and steel, designed to break down resistance and encourage confession. I'd sent enough people to places like this to know the psychology behind it. The harsh lighting, the uncomfortable bench, the deliberate isolation, all calculated to make someone want to confess just to make it stop. But I'd also learned something during my years on the bench that Amanda had clearly missed in her research. I'd presided over custody disputes, domestic violence cases, and elder abuse proceedings. I'd seen every manipulation tactic in the book. Real justice isn't about who gets caught. It's about who tells the truth. And I was just getting started on finding mine. The metal door clanged shut behind me, and I settled onto the narrow bench to wait. My mind began organizing the facts, the same way I used to prepare for complex hearings. Amanda's sudden change in behavior, the timing of this trip, her insistence on handling my luggage. She'd made one critical error in her planning. She'd assumed I was just another lonely old woman, easy to manipulate and destroy. What she didn't know was that behind my quiet retirement facade was someone who'd built a career on spotting liars and making them pay for their deceptions. Amanda had made her move. Now it was my turn. After all, she might have planted evidence, but I had something she didn't expect. I had 23 years of experience in making people like her pay for their lies. Michael arrived exactly 42 minutes after my call, wearing the same worried expression he'd worn during our most difficult cases. Through the small window in the holding room door, I watched him flash his credentials and speak in low, urgent tones with Officer Martinez. When they finally brought me out, Michael's first words weren't what I expected. "Anna, what the hell have you gotten yourself into?" His voice carried genuine concern, but underneath it was something else. Familiarity. He knew me well enough to understand that if I was here, there was more to the story. "I've been set up," I said simply as we settled into a private consultation room. "By my daughter-in-law." Michael opened his briefcase and pulled out a legal pad, his movements automatic after years of practice. "Start from the beginning. Everything. I told him about Amanda's sudden change in behavior, the insistence on this trip, her handling of my luggage. As I spoke, I watched his expression shift from skepticism to recognition. He'd seen cases like this before. Amanda Phillips Hoffman, he said, consulting notes he'd apparently made during his drive over. 34 years old, married to your son David for 3 years. No prior criminal record, but that doesn't mean much these days. What else did you find? Michael's expression darkened. She's been busy, Anna. Very busy. I made some calls while driving over here. Amanda's been asking questions about you around town. Your health, your finances, your daily routine. She even visited Dr. Reynolds last month, claiming she was concerned about your mental state. The words hit me like a physical blow. Dr. Reynolds had been my physician for 15 years. The idea that Amanda had gone to him, planted seeds of doubt about my competency, felt like a violation beyond what she'd already done. She's been building a case, I said, understanding flooding through me. This isn't just about getting me arrested. This is about proving I'm unfit, unstable. She wants me declared incompetent. That's what I'm thinking, too. Michael leaned forward, his voice dropping. Anna, there's something else. I ran a background check on her maiden name. Amanda Phillips has a history you need to know about. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents I recognized from my years on the bench. Court records, police reports, restraining orders. She was married before David. Michael continued. Twice, actually. Both marriages ended badly. The first husband, Robert Phillips, filed for a restraining order claiming Amanda had tried to have him committed to a psychiatric facility after drugging his coffee with anxiety medication. My hands went cold as I read through the documents. The pattern was becoming clear. The second husband, James Morrison, disappeared entirely after their divorce. Left town, changed his name, the works. But before he vanished, he filed a police report claiming Amanda had planted drugs in his car and called in an anonymous tip. I looked up from the papers, meeting Michael's gaze. She's done this before. More than once. And Anna, there's something about the timing that bothers me. David's been talking about updating his will lately. Amanda's been pushing him to include provisions for your care, claiming you're becoming forgetful and need supervision. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Amanda hadn't just decided to destroy me on a whim. This was a calculated, long-term plan to remove me from David's life while positioning herself as the caring daughter-in-law who'd tried to help. If I'm convicted of drug possession, I said slowly, especially at my age, it supports her narrative that I'm losing my mental faculties. David would feel he had no choice but to have me institutionalized. And she'd be there to help him make those difficult decisions about your care, Michael finished. Very convenient for someone who's been systematically isolating you from your son. I thought about the past 3 years, seeing them now through this new lens. The gradual reduction in invitations to family events. The way Amanda would interrupt conversations between David and me, redirecting his attention. The subtle comments about my age, my living situation, my ability to care for myself. She's been playing a very long game, I said. The question is, how do we prove it? Michael tapped his pen against the legal pad. The evidence against you is pretty damning. 2 grams of cocaine in your personal bag, no witnesses to corroborate your story about her planting it. But we have her history, I pointed out. 2 previous marriages with similar allegations. Allegations that were never proven. And Anna, I have to be honest with you. Even with this background information, it's going to be an uphill battle. You're 65 years old, traveling alone, and they found drugs in your possession. A jury might find it easier to believe you've developed a drug problem than to accept an elaborate frame-up conspiracy. The weight of my situation was starting to settle in. Amanda had chosen her method carefully. Drug possession by an elderly person would be shocking enough to overshadow any claims of being framed. It would make me look desperate, delusional, exactly the kind of person who needed to be managed by caring family members. There has to be something, I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. Amanda made mistakes. She always does. People like her always think they're smarter than everyone else, but they leave traces. Michael studied my face. What are you thinking? I'm thinking like a judge again. I leaned back in the chair, feeling my mind shift into the analytical mode that had served me for over 2 decades. Amanda needed access to drugs to plant in my bag. She needed knowledge of airport security procedures to know exactly where and when to act, and she needed to ensure I'd be caught at the right moment. Go on. She's not a career criminal, Michael. She's an amateur who's gotten lucky twice before. But this time, she's dealing with someone who spent 23 years watching people lie under oath. I pulled out my phone, grateful that they'd returned my personal effects during the consultation. I need you to contact Detective Sarah Chen at LAPD. Tell her Judge Anna Hoffman needs to speak with her about a case that might be connected to 2 previous incidents in her jurisdiction. Michael raised an eyebrow. Sarah Chen? She appeared in my courtroom several times over the years. Domestic violence cases mostly. She's thorough and she doesn't like people who prey on family members. I met his gaze. And Michael? Tell her I think we're looking at someone who's done this before and plans to do it again. As Michael made notes, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my retirement. The familiar surge of purpose that came with seeking justice. Amanda thought she'd neutralized me, turned me into a helpless victim who could be easily discredited. She had no idea that she'd just awakened the same instincts that had made me one of the most respected judges in the state. The consultation room door opened and Officer Martinez appeared. Mrs. Hoffman, we're ready to process your release on bail. I looked at Michael, who nodded. I've arranged everything. You'll be released on your own recognizance, but you can't leave the state. As we gathered our things, I felt Amanda's shadow over everything. She was probably at home right now, playing the role of the concerned daughter-in-law, telling David how worried she was about me. How she'd seen signs of instability that she should have recognized sooner. But Amanda had made one crucial error in her planning. She'd assumed that a retired judge would be as helpless as her previous victims. She was about to learn otherwise. Detective Sarah Chen met me at a small diner in downtown LA, far from the courthouse where we'd first crossed paths. She looked older than I remembered, her dark hair streaked with premature gray, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had impressed me during her testimony years ago. Judge Hoffman, she said, sliding into the booth across from me. Michael Wallace filled me in on your situation. I have to say, this is the last place I expected to see you. Please call me Anna. I'm not a judge anymore. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, grateful for the warmth, though I suspect I'm going to need those instincts again. Sarah pulled out a worn notebook, the kind detectives always carried. Tell me about Amanda Phillips. Everything you can remember, no matter how small. For the next hour, I walked her through 3 years of subtle manipulation. The way Amanda had gradually inserted herself between David and me. How family gatherings became smaller and less frequent. The comments about my age, my living situation, my supposed confusion about modern technology. She's been very careful, I concluded. Nothing overt enough to seem malicious to David, but consistent enough to plant doubts about my competency. Sarah had been taking notes steadily. You mentioned she visited your doctor? Dr. Reynolds confirmed it yesterday when Michael called. She told him she was concerned about my memory, asked if there were signs of dementia he might have missed. She even suggested I might be self-medicating for anxiety. Setting up the drug narrative, Sarah nodded. Smart. If you're caught with cocaine, it supports her story that you've been struggling with substances. The calculation behind it all still took my breath away. She planned this for months, didn't she? At least. Anna, I looked into those previous marriages Michael mentioned. Robert Phillips lives in Oregon now, works as an accountant under his mother's maiden name. I managed to reach him yesterday. Sarah flipped to a new page in her notebook. He was terrified when I mentioned Amanda's name, said she'd ruined his life systematically, turned his own family against him. By the time their divorce was final, everyone believed he was an unstable drug addict who'd been abusing his wife. What about the second husband? James Morrison is harder to track down. But I found him through Social Security records. He's living in Montana, changed his name legally to James Miller. When I called, he actually started crying on the phone. I felt a chill run down my spine. What did she do to him? Similar pattern, but more extreme. She isolated him from his friends and family, then began a campaign to convince everyone he was dangerous. When he tried to leave, she planted drugs in his car and called in an anonymous tip. He was arrested, lost his job, and by the time the charges were dropped, his reputation was destroyed. And now she's trying the same thing with me. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. Anna, both of these men told me something that should worry you. Amanda doesn't just want to discredit her victims. She wants to control them completely. The drug planting isn't the end goal. It's the beginning. What do you mean? Think about it. If you're convicted, David will feel responsible for your care. Amanda becomes the devoted daughter-in-law who stands by her troubled mother-in-law, helps manage your affairs, makes decisions about your treatment. She gains power over both of you. The full scope of Amanda's plan was becoming clear, and it was more disturbing than I'd imagined. She wants to institutionalize me, then control David through guilt and manipulation. Exactly, and with your background as a judge, discrediting you publicly serves a double purpose. It makes her look like the victim of an unstable family member while positioning her as the reasonable voice in difficult decisions. I stared into my coffee, processing this information. Sarah, we need to prove she planted those drugs, but I don't see how. There were no witnesses, no security cameras in the bathroom where she had access to my bag. There might be more evidence than you think. Sarah smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. I've been working on this for 36 hours straight, and I found something interesting. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photograph. This is from the airport security footage, taken about 20 minutes before your arrest. Do you recognize the woman in the background? I squinted at the image. A woman with blonde hair was talking to someone just out of frame, but her face wasn't clearly visible. I can't make out her features. That's because she's deliberately positioned herself to avoid the cameras. But look at what she's carrying. Sarah zoomed in on the image. The woman was holding a small cosmetic bag, identical to one I'd seen in Amanda's purse countless times. It's the same bag she uses for her makeup, I said. Excitement building. But Sarah, this still doesn't prove anything definitive. Maybe not by itself, but I found something else. She swiped to another photo. This is Amanda's credit card statement from 2 weeks ago. Michael got it through a contact at her bank. I studied the list of charges. Most were routine, groceries and gas and department stores. But one entry stood out. Murphy's Pharmaceutical Supply, I read aloud. What is that? It's a medical supply company that sells primarily to hospitals and clinics. They also sell certain controlled substances to licensed facilities. Sarah's expression was grim. I called them this morning. Someone matching Amanda's description purchased a small quantity of pharmaceutical-grade cocaine hydrochloride, claiming it was for a dental office. My heart rate quickened. That's it. That's our evidence. It's circumstantial, but it's a start. The problem is proving she used it to frame you specifically. Sarah closed her notebook. Anna, I need to ask you something difficult. Are you prepared for what this investigation might reveal about your son? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? I mean, David might know more about Amanda's behavior than he's let on. He might have chosen to believe her version of events because it's easier than confronting the truth about his wife. I thought about my son, the boy I'd raised alone after his father died. David had always been gentle, trusting, perhaps too willing to see the best in people. But he was also intelligent. Had he really not noticed his wife's systematic campaign against me? I don't think David knows, I said finally. But I think he's been willfully blind to things he should have questioned. That's often how these situations work. The manipulator creates a reality where questioning them feels like betrayal. Sarah gathered her things. Anna, I want you to know what you're up against. If we pursue this investigation and we're right about Amanda, it's going to destroy your son's marriage. He'll have to choose between believing his wife is a manipulative criminal or believing his mother is a drug addict in denial. The weight of that choice settled on my shoulders. Part of me wanted to tell Sarah to stop, to let me plead guilty to a reduced charge and disappear quietly from David's life. At least then he could maintain his illusions about his marriage. But then I thought about Robert Phillips, living under an assumed name in Oregon, about James Morrison, so traumatized by his experience with Amanda that he'd cried when a detective mentioned her name, about the next victim Amanda would inevitably find once she was finished with my family. "We continue the investigation," I said firmly. "Whatever the cost." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Good, because I have a plan. But it's going to require you to do something that might feel uncomfortable." "What kind of plan?" "We're going to give Amanda exactly what she wants. We're going to let her think she's winning, while we document every move she makes." Sarah leaned closer. "Anna, how do you feel about wearing a wire?" The tiny recording device felt foreign against my skin, taped just below my collarbone where Amanda wouldn't think to look. Sarah had spent an hour that morning teaching me how to activate it discreetly, how to guide conversations toward admissions, how to stay calm when I wanted to scream. "Remember," she'd said as we tested the equipment one final time, "Amanda thinks she's won. She'll be confident, maybe even gloating. That's when people make mistakes." Now, I stood outside David's house, the same house I'd helped him buy 8 years ago, gathering courage for what might be the most important performance of my life. The recording device was activated. Sarah and Michael were listening from a van 2 blocks away, and my son had no idea his mother was about to prove his wife was a criminal. Amanda answered the door wearing the expression I'd come to recognize as her concerned family member face. Slight frown, worried eyes, voice pitched just low enough to suggest tragedy. "Anna," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "David's not here right now. He had to run to the office for a few hours, but I'm so glad you came by. We need to talk." "Yes," I said, following her into the living room. "I think we do." She gestured for me to sit on the couch while she took the chair across from me, positioning herself slightly higher, a subtle power play I'd seen in my courtroom countless times. The afternoon light filtered through the windows I'd helped David pick out, casting shadows across furniture I'd helped him choose. "Anna, I have to be honest with you. David and I are very worried." Amanda leaned forward, her voice taking on that caring tone she'd perfected. "This drug situation at the airport, it's not the first sign we've noticed." I kept my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" "The forgetfulness, the confusion about simple things, the way you've been isolating yourself." She shook her head sadly. "We should have intervened sooner, but we didn't want to embarrass you." The audacity of it took my breath away. She was sitting in my son's living room, looking me in the eye, and rewriting history to support her narrative. But I forced myself to play along. "I haven't been confused," I said quietly. "Maybe a little lonely since retiring, but not confused." Amanda's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of satisfaction crossing her features. "Anna, honey, that's exactly what I mean. The inability to recognize the changes in yourself, it's one of the early signs." "Signs of what?" "Dementia, Anna. Combined with what looks like substance abuse, we're looking at a very serious situation." Amanda reached across and patted my hand, the gesture making my skin crawl. "But the good news is, we caught it early. There are facilities that specialize in this kind of dual diagnosis." I stared at her, watching her construct my imprisonment with the same casual tone someone might use to discuss vacation plans. "Facilities?" "Specialized care centers where you can get the help you need. David's already been researching options. There's a lovely place in Riverside, very discreet, excellent reputation for handling cases like yours." "Cases like mine," I repeated, making sure the recording device caught every word. "Elderly substance abuse complicated by cognitive decline." Amanda settled back in her chair, relaxing now that she thought I was accepting her narrative. "It's more common than people think. The isolation of retirement, the loss of purpose. It drives some people to seek comfort in drugs." I felt my hands clench involuntarily and forced them to relax. "Amanda, I've never used drugs in my life. Someone planted that cocaine in my bag." Her laugh was gentle, practiced, the kind mental health professionals probably used with delusional patients. "Anna, that's the addiction talking. The paranoia, the elaborate conspiracy theories, it's all part of the disease." "What if it wasn't paranoia?" I asked. What if someone really did plant drugs in my bag? Amanda's expression didn't change, but I caught something in her eyes, a calculation, a moment of considering how far to push this conversation. Anna, who would do such a thing, and why? You're a retired judge living alone, no enemies. No one who would benefit from hurting you. She tilted her head, the picture of confused concern. Unless you think David or I would do something so horrible. There it was, the challenge, the invitation to make an accusation she could dismiss as the delusion of a sick mind. I don't know who would do it, I said carefully. But I know I didn't put drugs in my own purse. Of course you didn't, Amanda agreed quickly. Not consciously. But Anna, addiction makes people do things they don't remember. Things that seem impossible to them later. She was good. Very good. Every response was designed to make me sound increasingly unstable while positioning herself as the voice of reason. The important thing now is getting you help, Amanda continued. David's meeting with the admissions coordinator at the Riverside facility this afternoon. They have an opening next week. My blood went cold. Next week? We can't wait any longer, Anna. The drug charge, the erratic behavior, the paranoid delusions about being framed. You're spiraling, and we love you too much to watch you destroy yourself. I looked around the living room, seeing it now as Amanda must have seen it during her planning. The photographs of David and me had been moved to less prominent positions. The furniture had been rearranged subtly, making the space feel less welcoming to visitors. Even here in my son's home, she'd been preparing for my absence. What does David think about all this? I asked. Amanda's smile was triumphant. David is heartbroken, but he agrees it's necessary. He said just this morning that he should have listened to me months ago when I first expressed concerns about your mental state. You've been expressing concerns about my mental state for months? Of course. The missed appointments, the repeated phone calls asking the same questions, the way you'd tell the same stories over and over. Amanda was warming to her performance now, probably believing her own lies. I kept detailed notes, Anna. Documentation of every incident. You kept notes about me? Someone had to. David loves you too much to see what was happening, but I could see the signs clearly. She leaned forward again, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Between you and me, Anna, I think it started even before Richard died. The stress of his illness, watching him deteriorate, it probably triggered your own cognitive decline. The mention of my late husband's name in this context felt like a physical slap. Amanda was not just destroying my present, she was rewriting my past, turning my grief into evidence of mental illness. You seem to have thought about this a lot, I said, working to keep my voice steady. I had to. Someone needed to protect David from the difficult decisions ahead. Amanda's mask slipped just slightly, revealing something cold underneath. He's too soft-hearted to make the tough choices about your care. That's why he needs me. There it was. The confession I needed, wrapped in language that sounded caring, but revealed the true nature of her plan. So you're protecting David from me, I said. I'm protecting David from the burden of having to commit his own mother to an institution. By the time the drug charges are resolved, you'll already be getting treatment. It'll be easier for everyone this way. I sat in silence for a moment, letting her words sink in. Amanda had planned everything. The drugs, the medical consultations, the documentation of my supposed decline, even my son's emotional reaction. She'd orchestrated a complete destruction of my life while positioning herself as the caring family member making difficult decisions. Amanda, I said finally, can I ask you something? Of course. How long have you been planning this? Her smile faltered for just a moment. Planning what? This conversation. The facility in Riverside. The notes about my behavior. How long? Amanda was quiet for several seconds, studying my face. When she spoke again, her voice had changed subtly, becoming harder. Anna, I think you should go home now. You're getting agitated, and that's not good for someone in your condition. But I wasn't done. Not yet. One more question, I said, reaching into my purse as if looking for my keys. That little prank at the airport, the one you mentioned. What exactly did you think was funny about getting your mother-in-law arrested for drug possession? Amanda went very still. For the first time since I'd known her, her carefully constructed mask completely fell away, revealing the calculating predator underneath. "I think," she said slowly, "you should leave. Now." I walked out of David's house with Amanda's words echoing in my ears. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something approaching peace. The recording device had captured everything: her detailed planning, her manipulation of David, her casual admission of documenting false evidence against me. Most importantly, it had captured the moment when her mask slipped completely. Sarah was waiting in the van, headphones still on, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and disgust. "Anna, that was incredible." She laid out her entire plan. Michael looked up from his legal pad, where he'd been transcribing key moments: the institutionalization scheduled for next week, the documented evidence of mental decline, the way she's been manipulating David. This is enough to destroy her credibility completely. "What happens now?" I asked, settling into the passenger seat and finally allowing myself to feel the emotional exhaustion of the past hour. "Now we move fast," Sarah said, starting the engine. "Amanda knows something's wrong. The way you questioned her at the end, she's going to realize you were more coherent than someone with dementia should be. She'll either run or escalate." As if summoned by her words, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen. "Answer it," Michael said. "Act normal. We need to know what Amanda's telling him." I accepted the call, putting it on speaker. "Hi, David." "Mom." His voice was strained, worried. "Amanda called me. She's very concerned about your visit today. She said you seemed confused, paranoid. You accused her of planting drugs in your bag." My heart broke a little more. Even now, even after everything I'd learned, David believed his wife over his mother. "David, I need to see you. Alone. There are things you need to know about Amanda." "Mom, please. Amanda's trying to help. We both are. This paranoia, these conspiracy theories, they're exactly what the doctor said we should expect." "What doctors?" "The specialists Amanda consulted about your condition." "Mom, I know this is hard to accept, but you're sick. The drugs, the memory problems, the confusion about reality. We can't pretend anymore that you're okay." I closed my eyes, feeling the full weight of Amanda's manipulation. She'd poisoned my son so thoroughly against me that even direct confrontation wouldn't work. He'd been conditioned to interpret any resistance as evidence of my mental illness. "David, just meet with me once. One conversation, then I'll accept whatever decision you make about my care." There was a long pause. "Mom, I can't keep doing this. Every time we try to help you, you come up with new conspiracy theories. Amanda's been nothing but supportive, and you're treating her like she's some kind of villain." "Please," I said, hating the desperation in my voice. "1 hour. If after that you still think I need institutional care, I'll go voluntarily." Another pause. Longer this time. "Fine. 1 hour. But Amanda comes too. I won't have you making more accusations against my wife without her there to defend herself." After I hung up, Sarah shook her head. "He's completely under her control. Anna, are you prepared for the possibility that even with this recording, David might choose to believe Amanda?" I thought about my son, about the boy who used to come to me with scraped knees and broken toys, trusting that I could fix anything. Somewhere along the way, Amanda had convinced him that I was the broken thing that needed fixing. "I have to try," I said. "If I don't, she wins completely." We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop near the courthouse where I'd spent so many years. David arrived first, looking older than his 38 years, stress etched in the lines around his eyes. Amanda came in a few minutes later, having clearly spent time preparing for this confrontation. Her makeup was perfect, her expression carefully composed into wounded concern. "Anna," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of patient sadness. "I'm glad you agreed to meet. David and I want you to know that whatever you're going through, we love you, and we're here to help." David reached across the table and took my hand. "Mom, just talk to us. Tell us what you think is happening, and we'll listen. But please, Try to consider that your perspective might be influenced by your illness. I looked at my son, seeing Amanda's influence in every word he spoke, and made my decision. From my purse, I pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it on the table. Before I say anything else, I want you both to listen to something. Amanda went very still, her eyes fixed on the device. Anna, what is that? It's a recording of our conversation this afternoon. I pressed play, and Amanda's voice filled the small space between us. Elderly substance abuse complicated by cognitive decline. It's more common than people think. The isolation of retirement, the loss of purpose. It drives some people to seek comfort in drugs. David frowned, looking confused. Amanda, what is this? I fast-forwarded to the most damning section. Amanda's voice continued. David's meeting with the admissions coordinator at the Riverside facility this afternoon. They have an opening next week. You already scheduled my institutionalization? I asked David quietly. Without talking to me about it? David's face had gone pale. Mom, Amanda said it was just exploratory, getting information about options. I played another section. I kept detailed notes. Anna, documentation of every incident. What notes? David asked, turning to his wife. Amanda, what is she talking about? Amanda's carefully constructed composure was beginning to crack. David, she's obviously doctored this recording somehow. People with dementia, they can become very paranoid, very manipulative. But I wasn't finished. I played the final section, where Amanda's mask had completely fallen away. I'm protecting David from the burden of having to commit his own mother to an institution. By the time the drug charges are resolved, you'll already be getting treatment. It'll be easier for everyone this way. The silence that followed was deafening. David stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. Amanda, he said slowly, you told me the facility was just a backup plan. Something to consider if Mom's condition got worse. It is, Amanda said quickly, but her voice had lost its steady confidence. David, she's manipulating you. This recording is taken out of context. What context? I asked. What context makes it acceptable to schedule someone's institutionalization without their knowledge? Amanda turned to me, and for a moment, I saw pure hatred in her eyes. You have no idea what you've done, she hissed. David needs structure, needs someone to make difficult decisions for him. You're weak, you're old, you're useless to him now. The words hit David like a physical blow. Amanda, what are you saying? But Amanda was beyond caring about maintaining her facade. Years of careful manipulation were unraveling, and she was losing control completely. I'm saying your mother is a pathetic old woman who's outlived her usefulness, she snapped. She's taking up space, taking attention away from our marriage, from our future. Someone had to deal with the problem. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The problem? You're talking about my mother like she's garbage to be disposed of. That's exactly what she is, Amanda shot back. And if you can't see that, then you're as weak and stupid as I thought. The coffee shop had gone quiet, other customers turning to stare at our table. David looked at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. Really seeing her. You planted drugs in my mother's bag, he said, the words coming out like he was testing their weight. You planned to have her arrested, discredited, locked away. I did what needed to be done, Amanda said defiantly. Someone had to protect our interests. Our interests? David's voice was rising. You framed my mother for drug possession to protect our interests? I watched my son process the full scope of his wife's betrayal, saw the moment when everything clicked into place, the gradual isolation from me, the subtle undermining of my credibility, the careful documentation of fabricated evidence. How long? He asked quietly. How long have you been planning this? Amanda seemed to realize that her outburst had destroyed any chance of salvaging her position. She gathered her purse and stood, her expression shifting from rage to cold calculation. I want a divorce, she said flatly. And I want half of everything, including the house. David stared at her. After what you've just admitted to, you think you're entitled to anything? I think, Amanda said, her voice regaining some of its earlier steadiness, that you'll find it very difficult to prove anything. It's my word against a recording that could easily have been manipulated by a woman with obvious mental health issues. She was right, and we all knew it. Even with the recording, a good lawyer could cast doubt on its authenticity, could argue that I'd edited it selectively, could point to my arrest as evidence of instability, but Amanda had made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that her previous victims had been too intimidated to fight back, too isolated to find allies, too broken to seek justice. She didn't know that Detective Sarah Chen was listening to every word through the wire I was still wearing. She didn't know that Michael had traced the pharmaceutical cocaine to her credit card. She didn't know that Robert Phillips and James Morrison had agreed to testify about her previous crimes. Actually, Amanda, I said quietly, I think you'll find that proving things is exactly what I'm good at. The coffee shop door opened, and Sarah Chen walked in, badge visible, with 2 uniformed officers behind her. Amanda Phillips Hoffman, Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of law. You're under arrest for evidence tampering, fraud, and conspiracy to commit false imprisonment. The sound of handcuffs clicking into place was the sweetest thing I'd heard in weeks. 6 months later, I stood in the same courthouse where I'd spent 23 years of my career, but this time as a witness rather than a judge. The irony wasn't lost on me as I watched Amanda's defense attorney make his closing argument, using many of the same tactics I'd seen countless times from my bench. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, his voice carrying practiced sincerity. My client may have made mistakes in judgment, but we must ask ourselves, is poor decision-making the same as criminal intent? I glanced at David, sitting in the gallery behind me. The past 6 months had aged him, but there was something different in his posture now. The guilt and confusion that had consumed him after Amanda's arrest had gradually given way to a quiet strength I hadn't seen since he was a child. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Rachel Martinez, whom I'd known when she was a junior attorney, stood for her rebuttal. Poor decision-making doesn't explain purchasing pharmaceutical cocaine. It doesn't explain planting evidence in an elderly woman's luggage. It doesn't explain the systematic campaign to have that woman declared mentally incompetent. As she spoke, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. Amanda's initial confidence had crumbled quickly once Sarah's investigation revealed the full scope of her crimes. The pharmaceutical company's records, the airport security footage, the testimony from her previous victims, all had combined to paint a picture of calculated, long-term abuse. But perhaps the most damaging evidence had been Amanda's own words, caught on the recording device that day in the coffee shop. Her lawyer had tried to have it excluded, claiming it was obtained under false pretenses, but Judge Harrison, a colleague I'd known for years, had ruled it admissible. The defendant's expectation of privacy, he'd said, cannot supersede the victim's right to defend herself against ongoing criminal activity. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, their faces were grim with the weight of their decision. On the charge of evidence tampering in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted false imprisonment, we find the defendant guilty. I watched Amanda's face as each verdict was read. There was no remorse there, no acceptance of responsibility. Even now, even facing the consequences of her actions, she looked like a woman who believed she'd been wronged by an unfair system. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for the following week, but I already knew from speaking with Rachel that Amanda was looking at significant prison time. More importantly, her conviction would serve as evidence in the cases being built against her by Robert Phillips and James Morrison, who had finally found the courage to seek justice for what she'd done to them. Outside the courthouse, David and I walked slowly toward the parking garage, neither of us ready to process what we'd just witnessed. I keep thinking I should feel sorry for her, David said finally. She's going to prison, her life is destroyed. But all I can think about is what she tried to do to you. She made her choices, I replied. The same way she made them with Robert Phillips and James Morrison. This isn't about one moment of poor judgment, David. This is about who she chose to be. He nodded, but I could see the struggle in his expression. Despite everything Amanda had done, despite the evidence of her manipulation and cruelty, David was still processing the reality that he'd been married to someone capable of such calculated evil. "How did I not see it?" he asked, a question he'd posed countless times over the past months. How did I live with her for 3 years and not see who she really was? It was a question I'd asked myself many times during my years on the bench, watching families torn apart by abuse and manipulation. "Because she was very good at what she did," I said, "and because you loved her. Love makes us want to believe the best in people, even when the evidence suggests otherwise." We reached my car, but David made no move toward his own vehicle. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." I waited, sensing the weight behind his words. "Do you forgive me?" he asked quietly. "For believing her over you? For almost letting her put you in that facility?" The question hung between us in the late afternoon air. I thought about the weeks I'd spent believing my own son had chosen his wife over his mother. The nights I'd lain awake wondering if our relationship could ever recover from such a profound betrayal. "David," I said finally, "Amanda spent 3 years convincing you that I was becoming confused, dependent, a burden on your family. She was systematic, patient, and extremely convincing. She used your love for me against both of us." "That's not an answer," he said. I reached out and took his hand, the same hand I'd held when he took his first steps, when he'd cried over childhood disappointments, when I'd walked him to his first day of school. "Yes," I said, "I forgive you. But more importantly, I understand why you believed her. She was playing a game neither of us knew we were part of until it was almost too late." Relief washed over his features, and for a moment he looked like the little boy who used to run to me for comfort after bad dreams. "I've been thinking about something," he said, "about how isolated you've become since Dad died, how that made you vulnerable to what Amanda was doing." I nodded. It was true. Richard's death had left me adrift in many ways, no longer needed in the daily rhythm of caring for someone else, no longer defined by my role as wife and working mother. "I want you to move back into the house," David said suddenly, "not as a guest, not as someone we're taking care of, but as family, as my mother who belongs there." The offer took me by surprise. After Amanda's arrest, David had asked me to stay with him while the legal proceedings unfolded, but I'd assumed that was temporary, a reaction to guilt and crisis. "David, you don't need to take care of me out of obligation." "It's not obligation," he said firmly. "It's family. It's what we should have been doing all along, before Amanda convinced us that independence meant isolation." I thought about my small apartment, about the evenings spent alone with books and television, about the gradual shrinking of my world that had made me such an easy target for Amanda's manipulation. "Are you sure?" I asked. "It's a big change, having your mother living with you again." David smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached his eyes. "Mom, I've spent the past 6 months learning who my real family is." "I'm sure." 3 weeks later, I stood in the kitchen of David's house, our house, preparing dinner while he worked at the dining room table. The domestic routine felt both familiar and new, echoing the years when I'd raised him alone while building my career on the bench. The phone rang, and David answered it with the casual efficiency of someone no longer afraid of bad news. "Hi, Sarah," he said, putting the call on speaker. "Mom, it's Detective Chen." Sarah's voice filled the kitchen. "Anna, I wanted to let you know that Amanda was sentenced this morning, 7 years with possibility of parole in 5. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness at the news. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo the damage Amanda had caused, couldn't restore the years she'd stolen from her victims. There's something else," Sarah continued. "Robert Phillips called me yesterday. He wanted me to thank you for having the courage to fight back. He said knowing that Amanda was finally facing consequences has helped him start rebuilding his life." After we hung up, David and I sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten countless meals over the years, where I'd helped him with homework, where we'd celebrated birthdays and milestones and ordinary Tuesday evenings. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Going through all of this instead of just accepting a plea deal and moving on quietly?" I considered the question seriously. The past 6 months had been difficult, reliving Amanda's manipulation in court, watching David struggle with guilt and betrayal, facing the reality that I'd come so close to losing everything. No, I said finally. I spent 23 years on the bench believing that justice matters, that people who hurt others should face consequences. I couldn't abandon that principle just because this time I was the victim instead of the judge. David nodded, understanding. Amanda thought she could get away with it because her other victims were too intimidated to fight back. Exactly. She counted on isolation, on shame, on the assumption that people would rather accept injustice than risk everything fighting for what's right. I looked around the kitchen, at the home I'd helped my son build, at the life I'd reclaimed through courage and the help of good people. She was wrong. As evening settled over the house, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not just peace, but purpose. Tomorrow, I would meet with a victims' rights organization that had asked me to speak about elder abuse. Next week, I was having lunch with James Morrison, who was finally ready to pursue charges against Amanda in his home state. The woman who had tried to erase me from my own life was sitting in a prison cell, while I was surrounded by family, by meaningful work, by the quiet satisfaction that comes from refusing to be anyone's victim. Amanda had underestimated many things about me, my intelligence, my connections, my willingness to fight back, but most of all, she'd underestimated something I'd learned during my years on the bench. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about making sure that those who choose to hurt others face the consequences of their choices. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very persistent, it's about getting your life back. David looked up from his laptop where he'd been reading case summaries for his own work. "Mom, I love you," he said suddenly. I should have said that more often, especially these past few years. "I love you too," I replied, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "And David, we're going to be okay. Better than okay." Outside, the sun was setting over the neighborhood where I'd watched my son grow up, where I'd built a life with Richard, where I'd almost lost everything to a woman who saw people as objects to be manipulated and discarded. But I was home now, really home, surrounded by the people who truly knew and loved me. Amanda had tried to write me out of my own story, but in the end, I'd been the one holding the pen,